Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
As we look at the world today, at the time of this recording, there's a lot of social changes happening all over the globe. We've got social groups in the Middle East that are springing up from the radical Islam sect of ISIS that are threatening, people's lives. We have laws being passed here in the United States legalizing things like gay marriage and cannabis or marijuana use. We've got a lot of different immigration policies. We've got a trade agreement on the Asian Pacific end of the spectrum where it's opening more free trade between countries, giving a lot more power to basically businesses to orchestrate how governments interact. And we see all of these things merging right now or converging in our world. And I think a lot of times as we look at this, depending on whatever the issue is, it really doesn't matter what the issue is, whether it's from drug legalization all the way to, trade agreements on the Asia Pacific front, we look at these and we say, are we as a humanity, as a civilization, are we regressing or are we progressing? And I think that's really a fundamental question. And oftentimes, I believe, and we believe, that those two things can get confused sometimes. Things that look like they're progressive can actually be regressive, and things that look regressive can actually be progressive. And that's what we want to talk about on today's podcast.
Yeah. There's a really intriguing model that was, I think, is generally considered to be Ken Wilber's, one of his greatest contributions philosophically. Now, if you've never heard of Ken Wilber is a modern day writer and philosopher. He started something called the Integral Institute, and his work is done on integral theory, which is taking maps and models, different models of understanding people, humans, sociology, etc., and finding ways in which they all integrate, or the sort of the place where they all meet. And so it becomes this almost like a theory of everything. And his work is extremely interesting. He's done a lot of expansion on a model that we hold near and dear, which is the Graves model. His take on it is called spiral dynamics. His work is pretty heady. The books are dense and thick. And if you can wade through them, I highly recommend it because there's a lot of really great material and meat in there. And one of the models he came up with, or one of the concepts or theories he came up with, is what he called the pre-trans fallacy. And we're going to spend this podcast talking about the pre-trans fallacy and breaking it down and understanding how we could be, as individuals, committing the pre-trans fallacy whenever we're making decisions or whenever we're trying to figure out which direction the world is headed and what is the meaning of things, right? Like, are we, like Joel said, are we progressing or are we regressing? And sometimes it's not easy to tell the difference between the two. Now, the pre-trans fallacy, and we're going to try to break it down as simply as possible because that's what we do. It's this thought that there's not just two ways of going about things. The actual phrase pre and trans refer to different levels of rational thought. Okay, so think of it as pre-rational thought, rational thought, and trans or post-rational thought. All right, so what does that mean? Pre, current, and post or trans? Well, basically it means that wherever society is at the moment, all right, whatever it is that we're doing and thinking and all these thoughts we're thinking and all these concepts we have and the current ethics of the day, that is rational thought to us. That is the acme, or that's the pinnacle of civilization. Whatever it is that we're currently experiencing, especially if we happen to be the most developed country on the planet and we happen to, attract the elite and the best thinkers in the world, right? Or whatever country or continent we're on. Whatever's happening at that time period in history is, as far as we're concerned, the best of the best. And let's just call that rational thought. That's especially right now. We like to think that we're rationalists and we have a rational thought. Well, anything that's before that, right? Anything that is not quite caught up with the rest of the world in either development or in thought or concept is considered pre-rational. All right, it's not caught up with the rest of the world. It's not quite as sophisticated. And then post-rational or trans-rational thought is anything that's actually graduated beyond the current wisdom of the day. It's something that is entering a new space. And generally what ends up happening is whatever is trans or post-rational thoughts leads the way, and then eventually whatever's the current society catches up with it. And then that becomes the current rational thoughts. And then great thinkers will think even greater things and be mavens of new ideas, and then they'll become the trans rational thought. Okay, so that makes sense that it's always a moving target. We're always developing. But whatever is the common accepted wisdom of the time, that's rational. And anything that hasn't caught up to it is considered pre-rational. And anything that's after that, anything that's reaching to a higher level or a new space is considered trans-rational. All right, so the point of understanding these three is that we have a tendency as people to see rational or irrational. That's all we see. We see two different segments. We either see people who are caught up with the modern wisdom of the day, and then there's everybody else. So what happens with the pre-trans fallacy is that anybody who doesn't fit into the modern current wisdom of the day is considered other, because we don't see three categories. We don't see before, during, after. We only see this or that. And so since we only see this or that, a person who is trans or post-rational, who could be on the cutting edge of something new that rest of society hasn't caught up with, could be lumped in with pre-rational, right? We could see something that's actually more sophisticated than us as less sophisticated because we don't see the three different levels. We only see two possibilities. You're either with us or against us. And if you're against us, then you're all lumped into the same thing. So the people who are trans actually get lumped in with the pre, and vice versa. If we have a tendency to celebrate anything that's not currently rational, then we'll see pre-rational as trans-rational. We'll see something that's just an other as being all good. So we either see it as all good or all bad. And that is a fallacy, right? That is not being able to create distinctions amongst what is truly progressive and what is actually regressive.
So let's take a really basic example here just to kind of illustrate this on something that pretty much everyone that's listening, if you're listening, you probably will understand what I'm talking about. Let's assume that you take a little small prop airplane and you fly it into the jungles of Brazil in South America, and you land that airplane in a little village that has never seen an airplane before in their entire life. This is the first time this small village of people has seen an airplane land in their village. Now, the rationale or the rational thought in that village is everything they see in the jungle around them and the village. That's all very rational. That's things they understand. If an airplane lands, the idea that that airplane is probably like some type of a weird large bird or some other craft of animal is very high, because the only thing that people in that village understand, they don't understand technology and how airplanes are constructed, how airplanes look. It looks like some type of a flying creature of sorts. And so they're going to, instead of seeing that as technological advancement, they might put an animal nature to that airplane landing in their small village, because their thought cannot see what an airplane's technology might be. They've never had that experience before. And so they'll categorize that as something from the animal world, most likely. And it could be potentially a threat. This large dinosaur-y, like flying creature coming down to their village might pose a threat to them, and they don't see that it's just technology landing in their village. So this is a very basic example on a primitive level of someone looking at something that's more advanced than them and attributing things that aren't as advanced as them, attributing a bird to this airplane instead of the fact that it's a technological advancement from some other society somewhere else.
Yeah, and we do this all the time. We as individuals, I mean, we can look at the example that Joel just gave, which is of a primitive people that don't understand modern technology and so are applying something, less than like an animal. And that's easy to mock, right? It's easy to go, oh, they're just really unsophisticated. And yet we do this all the time.
Well, and to those people, if you grow up in a tribe in the jungle and that's your only experience, you believe you are at the pinnacle of human development. You have nothing else to measure against. And so you see anything else as less than where you're at right now.
Exactly. And we've been doing it for a long time. Every time society has reached a certain pinnacle, well, that's all the time, right? We're always at a pinnacle of something. Then we assume that we've arrived, right? Like, that's it. We arrived. Here we are in the modern world. And look at all the amazing things. Think about the 60s and how they must have felt like, we talked about this. We love the show Mad Men. And we talk about how in the 60s, especially considering that, the people who were Don Draper, okay, he was in his 30s, 40s during this time period. And in the show, Don Draper talks about how he grew up like without indoor plumbing, basically. And so in the 60s, it must have felt so sleek and sophisticated and like so, like they must have just felt like as humanity, they had arrived in the 60s. And yet their computers were the sizes of like entire rooms or buildings, right? And they hadn't yet gone to the moon, until the end of the decade. And there are so many technological advancements that they just simply hadn't made, right? I mean, right now we're walking around with computers in our pocket that were more sophisticated than the computers that filled entire buildings in the past. So, but they must have felt like they had arrived. Like, here we are, right? We're humanity. Look at the epoch of humanity. And that was, 50 years ago. And we're just like, wow, they really, they had a lot of fashion mistakes they were about to make. And there was a lot of technology to yet be, developed. However, we're going to feel the same way because that's just human nature. And we acclimate very quickly to our current society. And it's very difficult for us to be open to the idea that there's a lot more coming down the pike. Now, I actually feel like this generation of people that, like our generation, Joel and I are like, we're somewhere between Generation X and Millennials. We just kind of fall in between those two generations. And I think Generation X, our generation, whatever that may be, and Millennials, I think we're seeing technology develop so quickly that we're more and more open to the idea of like, this is not the pinnacle, right? Because we see information double so quickly that we're like, oh, there's a lot more to come. And oh my gosh, AI, and hopefully that won't destroy all of humanity. And like, I mean, we get that we're not at the pinnacle.
The iPhone 7 is coming.
Yeah, exactly. However, we're the first generation to watch technology double so quickly. Like, it's not ever been like this before. In fact, what was it, like 100 years ago was the first generation to observe information double in their lifetime. Yeah. Before that, people didn't experience a doubling of information in their lifetime. So it really did feel like they were at the pinnacle. And even if we acknowledge that technology is going to change, we still get this sense that we've arrived in some ways. And that somehow society is stable enough and that we have learned enough that, there's no reason to open ourselves up to anything that's not rational. And I especially see this in like scientific fields that are very rational, very skeptical, right? Like the ones who are the most skeptical, you can really see that this is an idea of like there's rational thought and then there's everybody else. So even the people who are expecting and anticipating a lot of technological advancements, even they feel like we've kind of got to the pinnacle of rational thought. Now, that's not to say that scientists or the people in the scientific field don't acknowledge that there's always new things to learn, right? Like, I mean, obviously, science is probably the most accepting of new concepts and new thoughts as long as it's provable. However, anything that's mystical, anything that doesn't fall into the realm of like scrutiny through scientific method in a very specific way is considered irrational and is thrown out. So we see this happen throughout history. We see it happening now. And what's fascinating about this is that when we project onto the world a feeling of either or, you're either rational or irrational. You're either caught up to, the pinnacle or you're pre-pinnacle. Then there's a lot of cool stuff that might be coming out. A lot of things that are massively progressive that we'll just completely disregard, right? Like we just be like, oh, that's bogus. That's woo-woo. That's ridiculous. And there's no reason to give it any thought at all. That was actually one of the two styles of the pre-trans fallacy that Ken Wilber talks about. He actually talks about two. And he calls them PTF1 and PTF2, which of course I love because of, back to our podcast about general semantics, which is this idea of like labeling distinctions even between, even amongst its own category. So he calls them PTF1 and PTF2. And PTF1 is the kind of fallacy that I just was mentioning, which is, among, say, orthodox science, which is that anything with a mystical bent is irrational. And so therefore, anything that could be progressive, even if it has a mystical bent, is immediately considered pre, right? It's considered regressive. We don't need it. But then there's PTF2. And PTF2 goes the opposite direction. And this would be more something that you would see amongst, say, Orthodox religion, which is that, we started out at the fall of man, and we have been consistently regressing as people, as humans, and we get further and further and further away from the divine. And in order to get back to the divine, you have to go through a series of, belief systems or
purifications,
rituals. Right. Yeah. Purifications, rituals, etc. And those don't have anything to do with rationale, right? Like it has to do with, in fact, the exact opposite. It's quite mystical. And so what will happen there is you'll see people seeing something that has a mystical tone, which is completely irrational, right? And very much regressive. But because it feels divine or it feels mystical, then the assumption will be that it's trans, it's post, right? So you RTF1, or excuse me, PTF1, pre-trans fallacy 1, is more like the skeptical scientist that sees anything mystical as being regressive, even if it's progressive, even if it's a trans rational. And PTF2 is anybody who sees anything mystical, which could be regressive, pre-rational, as trans-rational, right? And they elevate it. And you'll see things like, one of the examples I read recently was like the Jim Jones, right, cults.
Yeah, end of the world cults that believe you're going to drink Kool-Aid and die and all transcend this world together into some mystical land or planet somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. So it can go either direction. You can either be elevating things that need to be absolutely rejected, or you could be rejecting things that need to be elevated and really given some serious consideration.
Yeah, if you've listened to our podcast on the Graves model, I don't remember the episode number, but it'd be a great podcast to go back and listen to as well, because it interrelates to what we're talking about here. And as I'm thinking about the Graves model and the different levels of the Graves model, that's kind of what we were talking about when we were talking about this, because a Graves 4 and 5 who believe they have come up to the end-all be-all experience of humanity probably are committing PTF1 mistakes more by looking at things that are progressive, maybe a Graves 6 or 7 person or culture, and saying that looks very regressive to me. That looks very shamanistic or regressive. And then you probably have people at Graves 6 looking at, they're probably more at fault for the PTF2 viewpoint, looking at things that are mystical and almost just buying into them without vetting them against science or against the data sets that we have as humanity, and getting into the woo-woo without vetting it to some degree. Now, this isn't, again, across the board, but I believe there's a correlation here to some degree that these are trends that probably pop up in these three stratified Graves levels. And if you, again, need refresher on the Graves model, I'd recommend you go back and listen to that, because it's a great model to hang this framework into, and you can start seeing some of those things pop up, the patterns and the application from the Graves model popping up. Talking about the PTF1, people that are, this airplane lands in the jungle of Peru or Brazil, and I'm not picking on those two countries. I just know that there's people groups there that haven't had outside influence yet. It lands there, and the people group that's there on the ground assumes that the airplane is probably some type of a dinosaur-like bird or something, because they just have no clue what this technology is. And the person that lands there might, they make friends with the people, the tribe there, and somebody gets hurt, and they use some kind of herbal medicine on the person's wounds. And, the person gets back in the airplane, takes this herbal medicine back to the country there, the developed country they're from, and they say, hey, this herbal medicine works because we learned of it in this primitive culture, and they're dismissed by the scientific community as that's primitive, that won't work here, that's not going to be playing out, we're going to do surgery, et cetera, et cetera. And it's almost like it's dismissed because it's old school, it's primitive, it's not accepted in the current framework. Whereas, you've got people also in the PTF2 arena who, they hear something about some herbal remedy or something that some culture a long time ago used, and now they just, without really vetting it against modern science, they just buy it wholesale, and they begin implementing it in their life, whatever that remedy might be. And it may or may not work, but the point is they're not really thinking about all the different primitive elements that might be. It might have needed to be, like, for example, we were reading something about prisons recently using sugar to treat wounds in a stomach, right? And sugar does, in fact, help infection and bacteria, but it's not the best solution we have, right? So these prisons that are using this, it's not really a great option for an anesthetic. We have much better technology now, but primitive cultures use this. So something like latching onto that as a way to treat bacteria, in my mind, doesn't seem like it's the best option when we have other things we can use. And I think that was for budgetary reasons, but that was the first example that popped into my head.
No, I think medicine and diet or food, our relationship with health, is a great example of a lot of pre-trans fallacy. You've got people who, I hear this whole organic or not organic. Monsanto is evil or Monsanto isn't. Is genetically modified foods, are they okay or are they not? And you've got people in the, all genetically modified foods are pure, unadulterated evil. And now Monsanto being evil might have absolutely nothing to do with the actual seed, but rather patenting seeds, which is a completely different conversation. So maybe I shouldn't mention Monsanto, but this idea that all genetically modified crops are just pure unadulterated evil because they're scientific and they're not organic and they're not natural. And then on the other side, you've got, but genetically modified crops are fantastic because we feed so many more people. They're so much more, efficient. We could actually solve global hunger or malnutrition through genetically modified crops. So which one is it? And if you only see two sides, right? And you've got this, this situation of it's either evil or not evil, then you've created a false dichotomy and you can't actually see every single component as either current or post rational, or maybe you can't see one as progressive and one as regressive. You're just lumping the whole thing in with themselves because you've created this false dichotomy.
Yeah, and let's get another tangible example. I mentioned very early on in the podcast about the legalization of drugs. Here in the United States, at the time of this recording, there are a handful of states, and I think the District of Columbia, who have gone ahead at the state level and legalized the recreational use of cannabis, of marijuana. And this is a natural organic plant that grows out of the ground wild in all 50 states in the United States. Around the world, it's very easy to grow. It literally is a weed. That's why they call it weed, right? And it can alter your state of consciousness by either ingesting it, smoking it, getting it into your system. The chemical properties in this plant material can alter your state of consciousness, can alter how your mind is functioning. And we are right now in a hot debate where on one side you have, so most people's experience with cannabis was some type of experience in high school or college. Most people that are alive today, during an experimental time period in their life, in the time period when they're maybe more rebellious than other time periods, they didn't have to get real quote unquote serious about life and get a day job and show up to work. That was most people's experience with this substance. And when they grow up, they give that up and they move on into quote unquote the adult world, and they begin to see that as something that teenagers or college students or kind of the bums of life, the people that are low lifes, are not with society. They're not civilized people, engage in partaking of the cannabis plant. And then you've got So you've got this legal issue of wanting to legalize this, and the discussion is, well, that's so regressive as a culture. That's something we should have gotten through in high school and college. Like, to legalize this now and sanction it for adults to use as recreation, isn't that turning all of the adults in the world, all of the adults legally, into being able to access this plant, to partake of it, and then regress them back to that prior state in their lives?
Are we just sanctioning making bums?
Yeah, exactly. We're just sanctioning a bunch of hippie, smoking pot, doing nothing but just sitting around and doing nothing for the world, playing video games. Now, the Cheeto company, whoever manufactures Cheetos, I think it's Nabisco, would love this because it's going to increase their bottom line. But most people, unless the politician's being lobbied by the Nabisco Corporation, a lot of politicians are very against this because their experience with it was at a time period when it was countercultural in the sense that it was a rebellious counterculture for them in their minds. They saw it as something that was at a rebellious time period of life. But is there a space? Is there room to open up the dialogue to say, what if you're looking at the legalization of something for adults to use recreationally, and you're lumping it in with something that is regressive? What if the use of this mind-altering substance is actually being used by people to be progressive, to open their mind to different possibilities, to expand how they see consciousness, to alter the way they see the world and they view things and the way they make their decisions? What if it is not just regressive? And what if it's not just progressive, but what if it's being used on both sides of the coin? And when you take that next option in, like there's people that are using this in progressive ways, well, now that alters the conversation. It says to me that, a 75-year-old that is smoking cannabis probably has a much different experience than a 18-year-old that's smoking cannabis. And is there any room for discussion here? Or is it all regressive? That 75-year-old that's now smoking cannabis, that's just regressive. They're revisiting their teenage years and this is an act of rebellion. Or is this something that we can see as another step forward? And I think this is the kind of thing we're talking about. When issues come to the table, we automatically lump things that look like they're from a regressive time period. We automatically put them into that category. And is that always serving us moving forward? And that's definitely that post-trans fallacy 1 or pre-trans fallacy 1 category of seeing that as a regressive thing.
Yeah. Well, and then, I think drugs is a great example of both the pre-trans fallacies, both 1 and 2. Because I know of people now. I'm actually personally, and I've mentioned this multiple times before, I'm for legalization basically of all drugs because I find it egregiously irresponsible as a society to throw people into prison for possession, right? Like that's just ridiculous to me. If somebody has a serious issue with drugs and becoming an addict, that's as far as I'm concerned, that's medical. It's not criminal. That's my personal opinion. That said, I'm not really for people taking any drug. There are lots of extremely addictive, very harmful drugs. And if you're the kind of person who has maybe used certain mind-altering, chemicals and drugs for personal development, maybe you've done a DMT trip, or maybe you've gone on an ayahuasca retreat, or maybe you've dropped acid and had like an incredibly mind-altering, they've used, before it was illegal, they used LSD. They started experimenting, doing scientific research on helping, veterans with PTSD get over PTSD using LSD. There's been a lot of indication that MDMA, which is the active, chemical in ecstasy, could be used for all sorts of therapies, right? Just insane amounts of therapy. So this idea that lumping all drugs as bad and evil and wrong, obviously, I think is massively oversimplifying the situation. And yet, if you're the kind of person who has dabbled in this and used drugs, mind-altering chemicals to reach a new place in your life and your personal development and become a better version of yourself, you might get to a point where you hold drugs in general in reverence. And that would include things like, really potentially very harmful drugs, like possibly cocaine or heroin or crystal meth or whatever. I have no personal experience with heroin, crystal meth, or with cocaine. And so I can't really speak to these for personal experience, but I do know that these are some of the top 3 most addictive drugs. And while I don't think that they should necessarily be illegal, I don't see them as necessarily being like great for most personal development work. And yet I could be proven wrong, and I'm totally okay with that. That said, if you have a reverence in general for mind-altering drugs, you could have a general sort of mystical reverence for drugs in part, like in whole. And that would be the pre-trans fallacy 2, right? PTF2, which is, since some of them feel very progressive to me, they must all be progressive, where we all know that drugs can be massively abused. We know people who have used drugs to a point where they have completely wrecked their lives. They've wrecked the lives of people around them. People have literally died because of their drug addictions. Not people, like a lot of people have died based on drug addictions. So a concept like drugs, you could totally see how these fallacies would come about in both directions. You could see how they would be, a person could say all drugs are evil and wrong because they are mentally thinking of like that kid that ruined his family and his family's, or ruined his life and his family's life because of drug addiction. And you could have in your mind an ayahuasca trip that allowed a person to, internally heal from their incredibly broken relationship with their mother or something, right? So whatever image in your head is the anchor, and now you're committing a fallacy because you're not actually thinking of them as pre, current, and trans. So you can really see how the pre-trans fallacy, just the concept of it, allows a person to be so much more thoughtful about their decisions, because it's not just an either or. It's not just an on-off switch. It's not just like drugs are good or drugs are bad. There's so much more nuance to it, and being able to take each thing separately and pit it against this fallacy and going, how do I actually feel about this? Do I feel this is progressive? Do I feel it's regressive? Like, what is my actual take on all of this? And am I oversimplifying things? Am I lumping, am I throwing out the baby with the bathwater? Or the other example I heard was, am I drinking the bathwater and making the baby king? Am I able to actually, create distinctions around these things? Or am I unable to see it because I'm seeing everything in an either or black or white context?
That reminds me of something that I've been playing with a lot lately in my life, probably for the last 3 or 4 years. I'm trying to begin thinking about everything in terms of and or plussing rather than or alternates. So when I'm confronted with two options, my first question is, can it be both? Does it have to be one or the other? And I've noticed that the more I can eradicate either or thinking out of my mind, the more it seems like the happier I am, and the more I can seem to come to conclusions and things that make more sense to me instead of and it's really frustrating the people around, because people that think in or terms, it's either this or that, dichotomous terms. If you show up with an and, I can see this and I can see this, it frustrates, because I think people want a clear distinction between this. So a quick example of this in my mind, and I wish this was different, but if I'm thinking about the courtroom scenario, like most courtrooms around the world, it's an adversarial, literally they have a verse between the two, VS, or period, abbreviated verses, Smith versus Johnson, or whatever. And I think in terms of like divorce and child custody issues, now divorce might be a versus thing, but in child custody, you've got two parents who've had a child, and they show up into a courtroom in an adversarial framework. It's an or situation. It's wife versus husband over who gets custody of the child, who gets access to the child, who gets to, share visitation rights and all this. And to me, I'm looking at that going, why does it have to be either or in that scenario? Why can't it be and or both? Why can't we look at positive like reconciliation or positive addition to the situation, a win-win scenario, not a win-lose scenario? Because in the adversarial situation of like child custody issues, for example, which I've been through in my life, I've actually gone through a court situation where it's adversarial. My ex-wife was on one side, I was on the other, and we had to determine what was going to happen with my two boys. And it was so heart-wrenching for me to think neither one of us are going to win in this scenario. And certainly the children aren't going to win, because they love both mom and dad, and both mom and dad love the kids. But because of how the courtroom and the structure of this either or thinking set up, it put us into an adversarial position around children, around people. To me, that is immoral in my mind, because now we're taking human lives and we're putting them into an adversarial situation. And so I always think in terms of, how can I not make this adversarial? How can I not make this an either or scenario? How can I make this a and scenario where we're working together to try to find a win-win in any situation? And I've noticed that the more I think about that, the more I do see options for that. I've done it down to the point where I try to eradicate the word but. I still haven't completely gotten this out yet. But when I'm speaking or writing, I try to eradicate the word but. So if I say something like, wow, this dinner was awesome, but if you'd only added more salt, it would have been even better. And instead, just say, this dinner was awesome, and it could have even been better with some more salt. It removes that either or thinking, or that like, it's adding things together. It's plussing things. I know it's globbing things on, and for you as your personality type, you like to clean slice stuff. But for me, it really speaks to this idea that we are looking for more win-wins as people. We're looking to find the things that are common to us as humans, not the things that divide us. So what do we have in common? As we talk about the integral community, the community that Ken Wilber founded, it's about finding the commonalities, not finding the differences, and focusing on the commonalities, building those up, embracing those, that and thinking, the structure of your mind, thinking in and terms rather than either or terms.
Yeah, I don't mean to pick on you. When you were talking about removing the word but, you said it twice, and that indicates how difficult it is as an exercise to do so. It's so difficult.
I said it as I was just describing what I'm doing. Yeah, of course.
Oh, I know.
Because it's so part of the way we talk right now, right? As at least English speakers.
I'm totally with you. I tried to remove the word but from my vocabulary for a while, and it was so difficult. I don't mean to pick on you. I just knew that
it's a great example.
I just knew that somebody was going to catch it, right?
It's a great example of how it's so structurally in my mind. It's so difficult to eradicate that.
I do the same thing. I've tried to remove the word but, and I say it all the time. So the question is, what does that have to do with the pre-trans fallacy? And I think what I'm really picking up, and the reason why it makes a strong connection in my mind as well, is if you can, we have so many structures that create false dichotomies, right? Like including, just one thing that is a daily experience not daily experience, but at least a high probability that it's going to happen to either you or somebody that you love, a court case with children, there is a sense, or even just a court case in general, there's going to be a sense of either or, right? And it creates these false dichotomies. And the question is, who gets to win? What's interesting is that a custody case is maybe one of the exceptions in the sense that I heard a lawyer say that you actually want both people to lose. If both people feel like they compromised and lost, you probably got a pretty fair shake.
Disgusting to me. It sounds right. So horrible.
It is.
We want to lose-lose. That's right. How we have an and there.
Exactly. And what's crazy about that is that we have so many infrastructural components that teach us to think in dichotomies. We have so much a part of our day-to-day experience that tell us to think in either ors. We have many presidential candidates on the ballot every year, but who do you hear about? Republicans or Democrats, right? And every once in a while you might see like a token libertarian show up. But there's people like in the Green Party and many other parties, and yet you never hear about them because our society is focused in on those real easy to grasp either ors. So it's difficult to think in terms of third option because our structure around us, our mimetic structure, our physical tangible structure, like our court structure, etc., teaches us to think in either or. And I think that might be the first step in getting to a place where you can observe and recognize and kind of go meta on the pre-trans fallacy, being able to observe it in yourself and other people. Just eradicating this either or thinking is the first step. If you can stop thinking in terms of me against you, me against them, us against them, this idea of black and white, this idea of these false dichotomies, if you can remove that from your mind, you can start thinking in three stages as opposed to just, like three vertical stages as opposed to two horizontal stages, which is what we have. So your technique of removing the word but and instead placing it with the word and, I think is a great first step in removing false dichotomous thinking from our mind and instead embracing this concept of multi-layered, three options as opposed to just two. I think it's great. One thing that comes up for me as I think about it is, we've talked about this in, maybe even possibly every single podcast we do, but this idea of not outsourcing how you think, taking control of your final opinion on something, being truly thoughtful and truly mindful. I have to assume that because we are not designed, but socially constructed to think in terms of false dichotomies, I kind of assume that everybody's committing the pre-trans fallacy to some extent. And that includes me. I'm part of everyone. So my baseline assumption is that all of us are thinking in terms of this fallacy. So I can't outsource my opinions to anybody because they're probably committing the pre-trans fallacy. So if I just outsource my opinion to them, I'm probably then going to adopt their fallacy, right? Like to some extent, I'm going to see something that is transcendent as regressive, and I'm going to see something regressive as transcendent. I find myself parting from, my peers and my friends. I have a wide range of friends' opinions. I've got friends that are anti-vaxxers, and I've got friends that are super on the vaccination camp. I've got friends who have very much hand themselves over to modern scientific medical principles, and I've got others that are massively against it and are into only naturopathic and holistic medicines. I have friends that feel that Monsanto is the most evil thing in the world, and I've got friends who are so for GMOs, it's crazy. I've got people all over the spectrum, and that's just, I mean, those are some examples. I've got people who are, pro-life, and I've got people who are pro-choice, and I've got just this wide spectrum of friends. And I have found myself with all of these people agreeing a little bit with everything they say, and also disagreeing a little bit with everything they say. And I have a feeling that we're entering a space where a lot of people are going to feel that way. It's going to be more and more difficult to package us into one school of thoughts. One either or, I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative, I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, or like the very sort of the throwaway third label of libertarian. And I even found myself doing that. I was like, I don't really feel like I'm a Democrat or a Republican. I must be a libertarian. I'm not a libertarian. Not even close. There are some things that the Libertarian Party says that I agree with, and there are others that I disagree with. But it's going to be more and more difficult to put us in any specific ism, right? Or any specific school of thoughts, because we're going to see these sort of lumped in holistic, if you are for this in this party, then you must be against this. And it's going to be harder to package people that way because they're going to start seeing more and more of these fallacies. My assumption right now is that most of us are committing the pre-trans fallacy, and my assumption is that we're not going to be doing that for very much longer. We are going to get to a space where we can't be labeled as easily. And when you're not able to be labeled, that means that you're doing a lot of thinking for yourself. That means that you're picking and choosing what makes sense to you. And the more we can understand and wrap our heads around the pre-trans fallacy, the more when we observe something, we won't just ask, does it resonate with me and what I already believe and know? We'll actually ask, am I unfairly adding a bias to this and making an assumption that it is, transrational or progressive when it's actually regressive? And vice versa. Am I committing one of the pre-trans fallacies, either one or two, PTF1 or PTF2, and it will just add yet another layer of thoughtfulness to our otherwise thoughtful position of not being able to be labeled.
Absolutely. And be ready, by the way, if you go down this road of detaching from identifying in one camp or another, or with an ideology or an encapsulated belief system, that you not only will be attacked by people that you might disagree with in the moment, so you have a stance that other people disagree with, you might be attacked from all sides, because sometimes, let's talk about just something basic like liberal and conservative. If you don't identify with either camp, both camps hate you because they're like, well, you're just wishy-washy. You don't stand for anything. You don't take a stand with us on this side or take a stand against us. We'd respect you more if you at least took a stand against us, because then we know where you stand. And you almost get like this blast in the face anger and frustration from people sometimes, because if you're unwilling to take a stand on one side or the other, they feel like you're either checked out, or you're being pretentious, or you're attempting to not deal with issues in the real world as they would see it.
Or if you say something that disagrees with them.
And if you say something See, I helped you in the moment.
Thank you. I appreciate that. See, I called you out earlier, but you called me out now because we do this a lot.
Exactly. It's so hard.
And if you make a comment that goes against them in whatever is the particular issue of the moment, they will label you as the other. So if I'm talking to somebody who's a conservative and I mention something that might sound like a liberal perspective or just disagree with a conservative perspective, they will label me a liberal. And vice versa. If I'm talking to a liberal and I mention something that disagrees with the liberal perspective, quote unquote, they will label me a conservative. The only pass we get is if you're a libertarian. That's the only one that I've seen is like the possible third option. And I feel like that's ridiculous. That is not the only other option. There are many options. But that said, yeah, you definitely will get some heat from all sides because people are still thinking in false dichotomous ways.
And what's so fascinating about this is conversation, thoughtful exercises around, thought exercises, podcasts like this, really trying to understand issues and get around what's actually going on, the etymology of issues. We have a technology available to us to communicate more and more and more in the world and actually tackle some of these things, to talk about these things, to talk about the pre-trans fallacy, to talk about, okay, is this something that's regressive? Is this something that's progressive? And instead of using that technology, in my view, for that end, I see it being hijacked for more and more sound bites. And it's so frustrating to watch, news segments where they're adversarially attacking their guests to try to get a sound bite so they can disagree with it. And I understand that it's for ratings, it's for commercial purposes. And I'd give a call to you. Find ways that you can begin to help have more discussion, more conversation, because we're going to need more narratives running than what we currently have. We're going to need you as a transformational leader to step up and say, I'm not going to be in a soundbite culture anymore. There is room for sound bites, and there's a new world entering where we have to have more thoughtful discussion, more thoughtful engagement around the issues of our day. And we're running out of time, in my opinion. If we don't get on this soon, humanity is going to be threatened because we're going to implode upon ourselves if we don't solve some of these big issues in the world. And you, listening, have the power in your hands to be that transformational leader. So I want to encourage you, step up, have the conversations, hold space, find out the places in your life where you see yourself maybe committing the pre-trans fallacy. Where can you root that out of yourself? What are some things that you can do to set the example and then help facilitate discussion, help other people find reconciliation, find those win-wins in life, see if there's ways that we can come together instead of being opposed all the time. It's really going to be up to you. It's going to be up to me. It's going to be up to Antonia. We are the ones that need to take this upon our shoulders and help facilitate this. Are we heroes in this world? No, but we certainly can be transformational leaders in any aspect.
And we can certainly be transformational.
And we can be transformational leaders. It's such a structure of the mind, right?
I know.
And we want to hear from you.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts? What are your comments? What are your questions? You can leave a comment right below this podcast over at personalityhacker.com. We'd love to have you be a part of the community and your voice can be heard. You can also join us at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack.
If you like what you hear, you can subscribe to us on iTunes or various Android platforms. And if you'd like to leave a rating and review, we love reading your reviews. We love knowing how you rate us. And I think the iTunes rating review system is probably the most accessible at this point. I think you can rate us on other Android platforms. But I don't really know how all of those work, and if we get those that feedback as much. So probably the most reliable place to leave rating reviews is iTunes. However, if you are not an iPhone user, if you are not an iTunes user, we would love to get your reviews and questions and comments on personalityhacker.com right underneath this podcast, as Joel mentioned.
Yeah, I'm going to have a little neurosis now around using the word but. Every time we do a podcast, like, oh no! My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We can't wait to talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.